In today's method class, I'd like to talk about cueing and the importance of experiencing all different forms of cueing. It's important that we never tell, as a teacher, we never tell anybody how something needs to be done. I've recently on social media seen a few different Pilates teachers telling you how you should cue, why you should cue that way, and how cueing another way is incorrect. And when that comes to internal and external cueing, what the feedback is to each student. And I want to propose a different option. I want you to experiencing cueing from everybody, including me. Find what works best for you and your students. So over the last 20 years, I have experienced a lot of different types of cueing, and I've seen what works for me, my practice, and my students. And what I want to make sure is that you do not fall into the trap of listening to somebody telling you that this cueing is wrong or this cueing is right. It's super important. When we're a new teacher and we're reading something and the person says, don't do this type of external or internal cue or tactile cue or verbal cue or whatever these are that we're reading, and do it this way. Be very aware that even if somebody says, quote, it's scientifically based. Well, I'm here to tell you science is theory. And what I want to convey in today's class is to experience all types of cueing and learn and experience with your students and yourself what works, and never ever succumb to listening to somebody and having them tell you it needs to be a certain way. All right, so I'm off my soapbox. I've been very frustrated looking at social media and reading, and there's these people telling you not to do something. And I will tell you, over 20 years, I've been doing that they're saying not to do. And it's kind of hard, but I also realize these students are brand new and they're very passionate, or these teachers are brand new and very passionate. So they read something and are like, oh, wow, that's how it's supposed to be. And then they go and they tell everybody that that's how it's supposed to be, as opposed to reading some new science, experiencing it over the years before they start telling somebody how to do it. So please be aware of that. So I'm going to use a form of, it's a kinesthetic type cueing, because a lot of the times we can use verbal and tactile cues, meaning I'm either talking to my student or I'm touching them. And those are certain kinds of feedback. I can also use activate the glute as a verbal cue, or I can say feel your glutes or your hips do this. I can use imagery cueing too to get the glutes to activate. The one thing that I really like to talk about in as far as tactile cueing, let's say that somebody is gripping their quads and they're actually doing standing hip stretch or some type of anterior hip flexor thigh stretch, and their glutes are relaxed. Remember, if you're stretching the anterior joint, there needs to be some posterior activation to hold that joint together. So let's say I'm doing a standing hip stretch and I'm really stretching my right front hip. There needs to be some glute activation. However you get that to have the students do that, because that's called reciprocal inhibition. I want to make sure the glute is on, because now it's supporting this joint as I stretch that anterior. Now going back to a specific person saying, do not use muscle cueing. Do not tell somebody to, quote, activate a muscle, because it's not going to be healthy over the time. Now, I don't remember exactly why they said, but they basically were saying don't cue muscle activation. And what I want you to do is think about it from a mechanical standpoint. If I'm stretching the anterior joint, okay, that means that hip flexor, the anterior joint, and the glute is flaccid. The butt is relaxed and there's no muscle activation back there. You tell me, if I do not activate that glute somehow, however I'm going to cue that, What's holding the joint together? What's holding the joint together if I'm stretching the front of the hip and I have no muscle activation from the back of the hip? Think about that. All right. So if I am going to cue my client to find some muscular support and engagement, posterior, which would be muscle cueing glute activation, then I've got something holding the joint together. And when I don't have that, using that example, I don't have that glute activation because I haven't cued it because I'm not supposed to do muscle cueing, then people are going to say, wow, I feel a much deeper stretch. No, you're feeling a strain because you're stretching the anterior. You have no muscle activation from the posterior because you're told not to muscle cue. And then there's nothing. That is a strain. That's not a stretch. So consider that why it may be important to muscle activate, cue. However you do that, whether it's touching somebody's hips and saying, let's feel some activation, cueing a verbal cue, um, finding something that works for them. That's super important. And that can go to a lot of different stuff. If I'm doing hug a tree and I have somebody complaining of anterior joint pain, meaning every time they bring their arms forward, it hurts. So that's most likely, in my experience, is their pecs and lats are not supporting that joint. So if I'm coming to a hug a tree, am I really trying to take my hands together, arms together? Or am I really trying to reach my arms forward as my skull lengthens up? That's going to be cueing muscle activation, whether you cue it specifically or not. So by telling my student to reach your arms forward, reach your knuckles forward with as much skull energy up, axial elongation, whatever word you use, cueing that length through the spine, you're going to get that to activate. But I can also walk up to a student, as long as I have rapport with them, place my hands at the top of the pec, have them hold their arm and cue muscle activation. Say, do you feel my hand? And feel as you activate that pec, it kind of push my hand up. Same with the lat. Press into the lat and then have somebody feel whether they're activating. That's a muscle activation cue. Now, for people that don't have body awareness, touching them appropriately, having them activate their muscles, they're going to be like, wow, that's amazing. So I want you to consider how important a muscle activation cueing can be. Whether, like I said, whether you're getting that muscle to activate by saying skull reach, knuckle reach, and thoracic extension, those kind of cues are all going to be around the joint to turn it on. And let's say we're not successful there, so cue those and palpate and touch and tell them, do they feel it? And I will tell you, every single client that has a shoulder injury keeps creating more shoulder injury because every time they bring the arm forward, they don't have that support of the lat and pec and they're hurting their rotator cuff. But you take the same person in complete pain when they do this and you cue muscle activation, pain-free, because they're starting to get that muscular support. Now, with that said, I'm not always going to cue glutes and abs and shoulders and pecs and stuff like that. Not always, because we do not want our student relying on our cues because we're not with them all day long. So when they're at home, and my goal as a teacher and the goal of this method class is to get you to understand that it is our responsibility. And if you're a student, then it's my responsibility teaching you to understand where this movement is applicable. So if I'm doing a hug a tree and I know when I don't cue muscle activation or AE or skull length or abdominals, if I'm not giving those cues because I'm not supposed to cue external, internal, or muscle activation because I've been told not to by someone because of science, it says so. If I can get them to understand those cueings are important for you to find something, but then let it go, but also understand if you're at home and you've got your coffee cup here and it's in the dishwasher and you've got to put it up into the cabinet, that's a hug a tree. The only difference is I'm raising my arm up to that cabinet. So I had a student, I will tell most of my students with rotator injuries or that are trying to recover or in the process of, I'll say, when you go home, be very aware. Start training that neural program for muscle activation, but then you have to let it go. And you'll know if you go to grab the coffee cup 6 weeks later, ooh, I feel pain. Guess what? You didn't muscle activate. You didn't have that axial elongation or the proper organization. And then it becomes a natural, as you get older, I have learned it's called conscious competence, meaning you're consciously aware of your movement. And it may take that moment of pain to go, okay, I have forgotten that. But I don't want it to be a forced muscle activation over all the time. I want to maybe use it to teach you, use it to re-cue you, have you understand it, and then move on. So I think that was a long-winded introduction, but very important to understand. Now, the two things, and we'll see, I think we'll have enough time in the 50-minute class to go over both. The two things that I find are tons of things I find with new students, but the two areas that they are completely clueless with is their upper back and their hips. What's going on at the pelvis? And because, can I see my upper back or can I see my hips from the back? Absolutely not. So a lot of the times we have to give them a feeling sense. This series, you can see I've got 3 props, and some of this will be a little bit uh, repeating another tutorial I did using the foam roller, but I want you to show you the different ways you can do this. And I've recently been working with a student who was taught, and I'm not going to say anybody's names, I'm not going to say any program's names because that's not important. They were taught to flatten their back. They were taught to tilt their pelvis backwards, which is I call pubic bone to xiphoid. That's pulling in, that's tucking, that's compressive. And they were taught to stay in that position. And when you're taught to pubic bone tuck or to tail tuck or imprint, I think is another word, or flatten your back, those kind of cueing doesn't promote mobility of the spine. It actually promotes stiffening of the spine. And if that feels good to you, if that is right for you and you've been doing it, I again don't want to tell you to change it. I just want to give you another option. And I call it the sit bone reach. Now, to teach the sit bone reach, there's tons of different ways to do it. I've done so many different types during my live workshops, and very coming soon will be my recorded workshops on progressive Pilates. But what works every single time is giving the student something to feel at their hips. So I'm going to start with the stability ball on the foot bar. And you will see or you will hear me cue this in other progressive and even athletic classes. I will say, roll your hips forward. Now, I try not to say roll your hips under. I want you to say forward and under or under and forward. If I do say roll your hips under, just make sure it's also forward. Because if I am in this position, and let me just actually go right to this because this will help you understand what I'm trying to say. If I have my hips on the ball, and this can be done hands on the long box too. Let me actually do that because it's going to be easier for most students. So I'm going to roll the ball up, and I don't really care where it is as long as it's safe on the bar, okay? So I'm going to put my hands here. Now, I'm going to adjust my feet, and I am lightly pressed against it. Now, I'm not smashing it, but I'm lightly pressed against it. Now, watch what happens to the ball when I imprint or flatten or tail tuck. What just happened? Did you see that? Of course you did. Now, that's taking the bottom of the pelvis, tucking it under and bringing it forward to the box. And I'll show you again. Now, yes, does that flatten my back? Absolutely. But what I want to make sure is we teach our students the difference between the bottom of the pelvis coming forward to flatten the back, or the whole pelvis articulating and reaching forward and down. And this is this example using this setup. So watch what happens when I really start talking about the sitting bones and what they're doing to the ball. I'm keeping some pressure on that ball and I'm rolling down. And with my shirt up, you can clearly see when I'm in this position and I tail tuck, what happens right there. You can see the amount of skin folds. I'll do that one more time. And I'm gonna really do my best not to thoracic hump or move my thoracic. So I'm really locking my lats and pecs. And you can see when I tail tuck, imprint, and flatten, what happens there. Now watch what happens when I do that sit bone reach. Imprint, flatten, and tail tuck, or roll the ball down, stretching. So this is actually the neural program that we want to use with our rolling down, our rowing front round back. This is the initiation in the teaser on the roll down portion. Watch again. This is how everybody and their mother or their brother, whatever the saying is, I see do, they do that. So this is going to give you some really great feedback, whether or not you're rolling and stretching and lengthening, or just simply pubic bone tucking. Try that with the ball. It's really great feedback. And as I mentioned in the beginning, my cueing completely is up to me. My cueing is up to me and what works for my personal practice. If you read anything or hear something that tells you this is how it's supposed to be, try what they're saying. If it works for you, great. But be very aware that teaching people certain kind of cueing, even if the cueing, let's say that the cueing tuck your tail on you actually gets you that stretch and that sit bone reach, because that's how you know to do it. Just remember that may not work for somebody else. Just think about that, because what we have learned in our practice, in our teacher training and our continuing education, that cue may have been taught to us with really specificities, but then we lost that specificity over time and we're cueing tail tuck, imprint, flatten. Now, let me go back to this. When I do a tail tuck and I bring my body away, you tell me, did the ball roll down at all? No, my body just pulled away from it. So when I reach my sit bones, watch what happens to the ball. You see the difference? And I feel a huge traction. So I have the option with visual elements, asking the student where the ball is moving, letting them see it now. I may need to demonstrate in my class, which I do quite often in my method classes, because my method classes are taught just like this. My intention in a method class is not to give a workout. My intention is to teach movement. Once I've got all the principles taught to my students, now am I going to move them? Absolutely. Instead of having a 10-minute diatribe like I did at the beginning on cueing and what's effective and ineffective as far as telling somebody what to do, they're going to be moving during the whole time. They're going to be doing footwork. They're going to be doing prancing, maybe feet and straps, maybe some stretching as I'm chatting. But when we're in video world here, you're probably just sitting there at home or on your reformer listening to this. But just know that you can teach this way. You can give information to your students, because I have quite a few students that come from all over the world into my studio in Palm Springs, and I want to make sure I give them Not if they're coming to a method class, that I give them a nugget to take home. And the most important thing to think about is your cueing that may work in your body translating to your students? Now, you may say, hey, Sean, I don't know the difference between tail tucking and sit bone reaching. And I just learned something watching you today. Great, that's deepening your practice. And the most important thing is experiencing continue education from multiple people, because sometimes my verbiage is going to be different than somebody else's and they're going to hear it differently. And I've had in the beginning some students that I've been telling them how to reach their sit bones. I've been telling them what to do. I've been giving them cues, and they'll go on vacation and they come back and like, hey, Sean, I just learned something amazing. In fact, this teacher is just awesome over in this city. And they told me to do XYZ. And oh my God, now I get what you were saying. So sometimes it takes trial and error, listening to other people's words and trying it with your students. If you've taken my workshop, you know that I talk a lot about demonstrating, using your body, showing them how to do it correctly and incorrectly, which is what I'm showing you here. And instead of telling you something's right or wrong, I want to make sure I'm showing you the two. Now, in the example of rolling the ball down, I'm feeling attraction, and I can ask you what you're feeling. If attraction is something you want, which is something that I want, then great, then you use that. Now, when I do the tail tuck, which is that compressive cue or flattening the back, in a healthy spine, you can get away with doing that. People do it all the time in classes. But with me, I've had 3 disc herniations. If I roll my pelvis forward, bringing my body away from that, I feel terrible pain because it's loading my back where I've had my injury. I also have scar tissue there. So when I do that, it pulls on that scar tissue and it compresses even more. And not really pulls on, but kind of bunches up, let's use the word, and it causes more pain because it's a little tighter in that area. When I do the sit bone reach and I roll the ball down, keeping my weight on that ball, I feel an amazing abdominal contraction and attraction in my lower back. So figure out what's right for you. Now, that ball, that can be done on the wall. It doesn't need to be, let me show you the other one I do when I don't have that. I can take my clients and put them here and then just teach them to roll the ball up and down. And the goal isn't to bring the pelvis forward. The goal is to reach the sitting bones to the heels, which is going to get that stretch with hands up, feet forward, arms down, doesn't matter. Whatever feels right for you, and experience all different positioning. This is something I know I've done before. I'm going to put 2 grippies on here, and I'm going to put the foam roller right up there. Now, I've got the wide foot bar, but this works on the narrow foot bars as well. And I'm just going to get my sit bones on there, and I'm going to roll. Let me get a little higher. There we go. And my goal isn't to bring my body away. My goal is to keep, so I can feel my sit bones. My goal is to keep that rolling up and down. Oops, I just slid completely off. There we go. All right, so right about there, roll down and roll up. There we go. So this one, when you get it put in that area, in the wide, it holds it really well. So for this one, I'm not going to get a big movement, but I am going to feel my body roll it slightly down. Okay, so that can be done. The really most important thing is when you're teaching this is never take your pelvis away. Always keep it reaching and stretching. The other one you can do is the small sticky ball. Put it here, put your hips on it, bring yourself to the long box and roll. If you don't have those stability bones, this one works just as well. Just make sure it's in the right spot and just have them do that. Now, when I start teaching this, please also be aware what's happening thoracically in my upper back. Nothing. So my goal is to make sure I teach them with this type of cueing where the movement in the movement is. It's in that pelvis, it's in lumbar flexion. And you'll see a lot of people when they do elephant that they're doing this. They're not only pubic bone tucking, but they're also, and then they're ending up in this rounded position. And when I teach this concept of reach the sit bones down with the ball back there, I can say prevent the ball from coming away and dropping, and see how far you can roll down without your upper back moving. And when you're on a carriage too, you can sense it because the carriage is going to move. So try those. Those are a really great way to teach. I've also done it reverse where I put the ball here and it doesn't really matter, and hands on the frame and roll up and roll up. You can do this. I've done it with the ball on the wall. It's limitless, but the most important thing is giving them that kinesthetic sense, that tactile cueing, that feeling sense of what's going on posterior, because they don't have that feeling sense, or visual sense to see what's going on. Give them a feeling sense, let them understand. And also when we're doing rolling down, once you've taught them the difference between tail tucking, imprinting, and flattening, and you've got them to understand that sit bone reach, that traction and the lengthen, you want to apply it to everything. So if I'm doing, and I'm just going to quick and dirty show you this, so I'm not going to set up. If I'm doing any sort of roll down, even if the carriage doesn't move, so I'm going to make sure the carriage doesn't move. Let's say I'm doing short box roll down, and I've got my feet in the strap. Am I tail tucking, which is allowing my pubic bone to go up, or am I sit bone reaching? And you can see too, when my shirt is up, if I tail tuck, that's what happens to me. Trying not to move the bed. So there we go. There's your tail tuck. That's lifting up. But if I think about reaching those sit bones forward, it propels me back into length. Let me bring both my feet up. I think it'll be easier to show you. So here is a tail tuck. And here is a sit bone reach, which allows my body to go back and up because I've done that feeling sense with the ball enough to I know the difference. Anytime we want to teach movement, on a mobile surface is most easiest. Anytime I can have the body part on a moving surface, which here, I do a lot in this exact position when I finish, and I'll just have them do that roll, making sure that they're finding those lower abs. I'm telling you, that's killer. But it also will give them a feeling sense of rolling the ball, immediately putting them on a moving surface, teaching them rolling the ball, and then putting them on a stable surface. And I'll show you stable. So there you go. Really feeling that roll, really feeling that stretch, and it is so amazing once you teach a student the difference. Your students that are complaining of back pain during roll up or roll down, or neck pain during a roll up or roll down, getting to understand that sit bone reach, getting to understand the difference between tucking and reaching, and sit bone reaching or tail tucking. It's really super important to teach them those differences. So when you do verbal cue them, and you may imagery cue them, you can always say, and just remember that ball on the wall or the ball on the foot bar, feeling sense, and recreate that when we do this movement. Because so many times we get often Oftentimes we start hearing these wonderful cues and all this, and we're still not getting them to understand. I have had so many students come to my student. Now, I'm really fortunate based in Palm Springs because it's a really great place to meet new people from all over the world. And I have people here half the time of the year, and then the other half of the time in the summer months, they're gone and they're doing Pilates somewhere else. And I've recently had somebody who moves beautifully, had been doing classes for many years at another studio in another city, and recently moved down here. And this individual was a tail tucker, and every time they tail tuck, they thoracically flex. But they were taught, and I've looked at some old videos of Joseph Pilates, and I've actually seen him pushing heads down, and I've seen rounding. And that's his teaching style. That was his teaching style. So is that appropriate for me? No. But am I going to say that that's bad? Absolutely not. That was his teaching style. So remember, classical training that follows that approach of rounding and coming together is how it was originally taught. And I see it still done today. And is there other alternatives? Are there other ways to teach? Are there other ways to do things? Absolutely. And what I want for today's tutorial to get you to understand, nothing is right or wrong. It's whether it is applicable to your practice. And I will tell you, your practice is different than mine. In my practice, I want to make sure I have some muscle size. I want to make sure that I don't have to go to the gym and lift. So I'm going to do some athletic stuff. I've got 3 disc herniations. I've got an injury to my right side of my skull from a head injury. I've got ankles that roll all the time because I have a flat foot, no arch. And I've got scoliosis. So is my practice completely different than your practice? Absolutely. But are we both doing the same thing? Yes, but our intention is different. And what's authentic to my practice and yours is going to be completely different. So let's go and let's talk. So the 2 things that I started this with were lumbar flexion. And when I talk about teaching movement from the movement, teaching the movement in the movement, sorry, where is it coming from? So when we're rolling down, always our initiation rolling down is lumbar flexion from the pelvis, from the coccyx. That's where the initiation is. So you can see right here, I don't need that ball anymore because I know not to tail tuck, imprint, or flatten. I know to reach. Now I'll show you with my shirt up so you can see the difference. Here is the old, or the type of cueing that I used to do, which was imprint tail tuck. And you would not believe how many people initiate that on a roll down and they're compressed. Or sit bone reach, tail tuck, sit bone reach, tail tuck, sit bone reach, tail tuck. Experience that first. Now, you may not need the ball to get that sense, but I will tell you, your students are going to need it whether you think so or not to be able to do what I just showed you, to be able to come away, get that feeling sense that the ball's still there, and then getting that stretch. Make sure when you do that, you immediately teach something that has that principle, lumbar flexion from the coccyx. Now, you may be saying, what the heck is lumbar flexion? What is coccyx? If you're not familiar with body terminology, lower back flexion from the pelvis, the tailbone, which is the coccyx, is the base of the tailbone. That's where the movement is initiated. I can initiate from above or below the lower back, but remember where we're really flexing from, or what we want to try to flex from, obviously is the whole spine. But 90% of all people, and I say some percentage numbers, they're not correct, but I'm trying to get the point by saying it's a large majority, they roll down like that. Or they roll down here and then here, as opposed to here and there, getting that length. Our job as a teacher, or my job teaching you, is to understand whenever we flex the spine. We either want to initiate it from the top, which is your cervical, or the bottom, which is from the coccyx. I can either do above or below. Now, my goal when we do it is not to hyperflex, which I would probably say, and I've repeated this almost ad nauseum in other videos, that's cat. So here's cat, and there's cow. So what I want to do in Pilates is get people to understand elephant is a perfect apex. There isn't a hump at the top like a cat. So I want to make sure that I'm initiating with lumbar flexion from the coccyx there, and then cervical. And I'm not trying to hyperflex thoracic, because me specifically and a lot of my students are already kyphotic. They're already thoracically flexed. So I'm going to show you lumbar flexion from the coccyx. I'm going to show you cervical flexion. And then I'm going to basically bend my elbows and stretch it all apart. Skull is going that way, sit bones are reaching that way. And here is the adjustment that I see most often people end up in. They let that collapse of the thoracic, they don't keep that stretch. So try that. Try the two ends flexing, and then just let your thoracic collapse and then feel it. And sometimes I'll have my students do that. I'll get them to this wonderful length. I'm going to say, good, now go ahead and give me your granny back and collapse and ask them what they feel. Because unless they have a feeling sense and a reference, when I am doing an exercise, if I haven't set up that understanding in the method tutorial, a class format where we teach movement instead of just going through exercises, no amount of verbal cueing I can give them is ever going to work, because they haven't learned the components. And I can say all these verbal cues to my students that I've taken the time to teach them this concept, and they can find it, they can get it. Now, let's say you don't have a method class built into your studio. If you don't have that ability, then you'll hear me say quite often, have a powwow before class. Say, hey guys, I want to show you this. Here's the ball, here's what I'm seeing, here's what I want to see, and then go. And you may need to reinforce that 5-10 minute powwow between each class for the next month. And if that's how you have to teach movement, then and to fit it in, then great. If you have a studio where you have movement-based classes where you actually teach education, which is what my classes, method classes are about in my studio, you come in to learn how to move. The other thing I wanted to hit in this is understanding thoracic extension. I will show you with the foam roller. Much like the pelvis, people have no idea, so we have to find ways to get them to understand the pelvis movement. Same with thoracic extension. Now, I would say that if I'm going to extend something, what am I doing? If I'm going to extend something, what am I doing? I'm straightening it, right? I'm lengthening it. I'm elongating it. And in my workshops, I ask people, if I have a collapsible antenna, how do I extend that antenna? Well, they're going to say, well, great, we just pull it up. And remember, if you take an antenna and you bend it, that is not extension. A back bend is not extension. Taking Swan as an example, and if you're in a Swan position, right? Taking the Swan from here to here, that's your max in your Swan. If you want to lift yourself up, it's hip extension, not back bend. If you're going to teach it a back bend and that's your intention, great. But I've had one too many adult gymnasts come to me with damaged spines because they were constantly back bending so much that they ended causing cumulative injury cycle on that movement, which damaged their spine. So I'm going to use this as an example. I'm not a fan of doing traditional Swan. It's uncomfortable for me. The amount of nerves and I call it the basement muscles down there, is very uncomfortable on this. When I'm standing here, it's not uncomfortable. So this is one of my favorite ways to teach it. Now, if somebody's complaining back pain, we can say Q abs, Q abs, Q abs, Q abs to death, and that's not the problem. The problem is they're trying to do a back bend. They're not extending their spine. So we have to give them successful ways to find spine extension. Remember, spine extension is not a back bend. If you've ever done the exercise where you start lying down on the carriage, feet on the foot bar, you lift your hips into a bridge and then you continue to come up, that's a back bend. That is not extension. That's hyperextension of parts of the spine. So just remember that. So when I'm in this position, abs are obviously engaged to a level that's supporting my back. But you can see the round in my back. My goal is not to back bend. My goal is to lengthen my antenna. My goal is to stretch my antenna. And giving that visual cue of not bending that antenna has been an aha moment for so many of my students. They're like, oh my God, I was always visualizing my spine bending, not straightening. Even though the word extension was there, I didn't listen. I didn't get it. So remember, teach your students you're not bending that antenna, you're lengthening and you're pulling it up to get a better signal. So here is what I would teach. My goal is not to move the foam roller. My goal is to lengthen. Remember, what lifts your head is not your neck. Your neck is supporting your head. So if my head is dropped, what lifts my head is my upper back. Let me show you again. You would not believe how many people start their extensions or their swans like this. It's unbelievable when I cue lift your chest, which I try not to do anymore. You say lift your chest and you see a whole class do this. And I try to, in tongue-in-cheek, tell people that ain't your chest. Your chest is below that. That was your head. So now by telling people what lifts your head is your upper back, that's changing anything. Or that changes a lot. I don't have a lot of bobbing heads lift up. So I can get myself in this position. I've got my rounded thoracic and I want to adjust that. Cue abs first. And then cue, find your antenna and lengthen it. Lengthen. You can also put this on their foam roller on their chest. Let them kind of collapse over it. Put your elbows up against it. And then let them feel what happens to the neck. Ask them to lift their head with their neck and feel that. And ask them to lift their head with their upper back and feel that. Watch again. Neck lifts my head. Or upper back lifts my head. Now, when you start teaching upper back lifts your head, you're using the weight of your head to turn the upper back muscles on. Now, let's say they're so forward flexed and almost frozen, then you better be rolling their upper back before you teach this extension. You better do some stretches over on your thoracic, which would be here, and stretch. And really getting that passive extension to get the muscles to stretch. And I'll definitely do some more tutorials on this. I spent a lot of time in the beginning talking about cueing and what you should do. But I also want you to make sure you try that ball, the big ball, the small ball, or the foam roller. You can do the foam roller on a wall too, and just get them to understand we're not pulling the pelvis away. When you're doing Swan, and I'll show you the full series I do, instead of doing, now I can do it now without hurting lumbar. I've gotten enough hip extension strength to lift me up to do the traditional hips here. I pad this, just so you know. That kills me unless I pad it. I'll do the feet on the gray strip or the frame at the front, turned out frog and full extension with the arms, no lumbar pain. That's because I understood I wasn't doing a back bend. Now, if you're teaching it as a back bend and that's your thing, then just disregard what I said. But if you want to prevent hyperextension of the spine, teaching students to extend instead of back bend, what lifts themselves up is their hips. It's a butt exercise. There's two ways to move. I can either move the pelvis around the femur, or I can move the femur around the pelvis. If you're doing Swan, it's technically what lifts your torso up. It's your pelvis moving around and articulating around the head of the femur. Now, if that went over your head, feel free to tell me in either a comment or an email and say, I had no idea what pelvis around the head of the femur is. And then you need to take my workshop, my progressive Pilates workshop, when it's done, with either in person, when that's available, or the online version. Okay, so let's go back, finishing this segment off with teaching Swan. So I'm here. I know I'm kyphotic. I can feel it. My head is dropped. I've got my forearm pressure on here, so my lats and pecs and abdominals are engaged. And I'm going to lift my head with my upper back to start. There's my extension. And then I'm going to continue to lift up, rolling onto my forearms, feeling what lifts my torso are my hips. Do you remember what I just said? What lifts your body up are your hips. So this is such a great way to teach this, and it's very low load on the spine. So I've got my feet, my thighs are shredded against it. If I want, sorry about that. I had a technical difficulty. My earbud just died, so I had to switch it to my left. Apparently, I've been shooting a lot today. So when we're when we're teaching extension, our goal is to let our students know we're going to extension and then we're stopping there. What we're doing is we're finding hip extension if we want to lift our torso up. So let me just show you what I see, and I have to be very careful because I can hurt myself if I do this too many times with my spine injury. So I will oftentimes see this, which is neck, and then I will see this, which is lower back. And I'm still flexed in the hips. I haven't extended the hips. I'm hyperextending and loading my lower back. So when you're in this setup, it's very, very easy for them to do it incorrectly without occurring much pain in their spine. But they need to know the difference. And then here, so I'm going to show you the first time what it is I see without talking. Then I'm going to correct it and do it the way that I would consider spine extension, stopping spine extension, and going to hip extension, versus going to spine extension, hyperextending the neck to lift the head, and compressing the back to hyperextend. So I'll show you first the way I see it often. And just think about where it is you see my finish. And then I'm going to show you extension of the spine, stopping at extension, not going to hyper, and then finishing extension of the hips. And look at my shape. And I'll do that one more time both ways. All right. So I wanted that to be a visual element. I'll definitely do some more on extension since I ran out of time. I really want you to start playing around with both that way to teach extension, explaining to your students extension stops when we're fully extended at the spine and finishes from the pelvis, from the hip extension to raise us up. Once you get that pattern taught in this position using this propping and setup, or teaching the pelvic lumbar flexion from the pelvis, and you start giving your students a sense, you're going to be able to really be able to teach them that feeling sense when they don't have the propping. So if they're pulling straps, prone pulling straps, long box, hands in straps, and you're doing arm pulls and you're telling them to find extension. Remember, it's not going to be very much. They're not going to lift up. If they lift up, I guarantee you it's lumbar hyperextension. Unless they have really strong hips and they understand. If you're prone pulling straps and you're here, and you can pattern it just like I'm doing here. You lift your head with your upper back, pull straps. If you can get up with hip extension, that's great. Most people are going to stop there. And that's where I want them to stop. I don't want them lifting any higher going into hyperextension. They may get more range of motion, but that's not perhaps a healthy alternative to that movement. See where you can do this and apply this. You're going to find using the long box and the foam roller on the top to teach extension. You're going to find that using the ball on the foam roller or the stability large ball on the foot bar is another really great opportunity to teach them pelvic mobility. Thanks so much for watching, and enjoy trying these different variations of teaching movement, and be sure to leave me a comment, whether it's under the video or private in an email. Thanks.